Thanks, SOSV. Hello, and welcome to a panel that I think is at the core of the themes at the SOSV Climate Summit today. We're talking about what should Uncle Sam, aka the US government, as well as governments all around the world, do to fund and encourage the development of solutions to our climate emergency. I'm Danny Crichton, the head of editorial at Lux Capital. Today, I'm excited to bring three distinguished experts on this topic to talk more today. First up, Sarah Hunter is Director of Global Public Policy at X, formerly Google X, the Moonshot Factory. Second, Dr. Jesse Jenkins is an assistant professor and macro-scale energy systems engineer at Princeton University. And third and finally, we have Robin Millican, Director of U.S. Policy and Advocacy at Breakthrough Energy. Everyone, welcome to the show. I want to start with you, Sarah, about a topic that I think is getting more and more complicated every year. We just had some of the most significant climate legislation passed by the US Congress in a generation. But there's increasingly more and more startups, more and more areas, more and more industries that are falling under this label of climate tech. Everything from agriculture to energy to devices, electronics, space-based satellites, you name it, it's sort of in the climate web. So how should we start to think about climate tech today in 2022 and what gets included and what does not?
It's a great question. Thanks for having me. So at X, probably about 50% of what we're working on now is climate tech. And I agree, it's an enormous category, everything from regenerative agriculture to green hydrogen. And it seems like everything we work on has some sort of carbon reduction, either mitigation or adaptation kind of angle to it. However, I still think it's quite useful for two reasons. One, governments, I mean, if you're in the industry, if you're in the tech industry or an investor, climate tech is slightly meaningless. You're either in, the meat industry or you're in the biotech industry, whatever. But actually within government, they're years behind where we are. And so even the idea that technology could be there to help you solve your agriculture carbon problems, it's useful for them. Secondly, I think unlike any other area of technology I've worked in before, policy is actually not a headwind, it's a tailwind. It's actually a real enabler to your ability to get to market and grow quicker and more successfully than before. So actually, I think it's a useful term because it helps you reframe the role and the relationship you have with policy.
And then Jesse, I mean, coming from the energy side, obviously very focused on energy systems, which is a huge part of this market. I'm curious, you're sort of the OG of a lot of the climate conversations, but you're seeing more and more entrants into this market as well. How are you feeling about the definition of climate tech these days?
Well, I think it is a broadening category, but I think that's because there are more and more innovations and more good solutions coming forward every year. And that's exciting, right? There's funding, there's markets, there's policy lined up, and there's a lot of creativity and innovation going on to bring forward solutions. And that's key because the transformation of our energy system is no small thing, right? We're talking about rebuilding and transforming the entire way we make and use energy all across the world. And that's just the energy piece of the decarbonization puzzle. So then add in agriculture and climate mitigation or adaptation and all the other things we need to do. And clearly there's a lot of room for a lot of different technologies and solutions to contribute to that. So I think, it's fine as a sort of broad catch-all. I think, as Sarah mentioned, when you're trying to raise money, you got to have a much more precise, pitch and value proposition and problem you're trying to solve that's going to be a lot more specific. And that's fine. Companies know that, and their leaders are pursuing that. And I think it is, it's a really notable space because it is fundamentally a public-private partnership that we're in the midst of, right? We are trying to transform our energy systems and our economies for a public good, right? To avoid catastrophic damages from climate change, to deliver greater public health, to improve environmental outcomes. All of that is, there's private value there too to many of these ventures, but there's an inherent public good nature to all of these innovations and solutions. And so that means that public policy has to play a central role in all of that. And companies have to get comfortable working hand in hand with the government in different ways, and vice versa. Policymakers have to, understand and get comfortable with what it takes to really spur private sector, innovation and capital formation and deployment.
And then, Robin, with the work that you're doing with Breakthrough Energy around U.S. policy and advocacy, I'm curious, when you think about the climate world, all these new areas joining together, is that helpful or hurtful from the advocacy side of getting people to engage on these topics?
From our perspective, I think it's all to the good. So, in terms of how we think about what's needed to get to net zero, we think, the stool really has three legs. You need technology that's, ready. You need policy to help scale that technology because, as all of us well know, there is no natural market, at least for low carbon products. So our founder, Mr. Gates, refers to the green premium as sort of the difference between incumbent, largely fossil fuel products and clean products that we're trying to bring to market. You need something to close that delta, either by making newer things cheaper or existing things more expensive. In the U.S., of course, our policy approach has favored the former, an incentives-based policy, but super important that we have policy coming alongside technology. And then, of course, you need capital that is ready and willing to invest in those things. And we can't afford to lose any one of those really important levers. They all have to be proceeding at the same time. So from our perspective, we're really glad that the conversation is broadening. As Jesse pointed to, some of it is semantic, but what is clear is we need all shots on goal, and we can't afford to be sort of picking our favorite things. We need all of it. There's great urgency in getting to net zero. It's not that far away. We're talking about less than 30 years from now. So a more broad, inclusive conversation from our perspective is all to the good.
Well, Robin, I read Bill Gates' book, I guess it was 2 years ago. He does a great job of sort of delineating all the different solutions and where the solutions need to go in order to get to net zero by 2050. I'm curious, you mentioned this green premium, and I think this is actually a really interesting concept and gets at kind of a core of the conversation today, which is around capital formation and how you fund this. As you said, there is no natural market for zero emissions or low emissions products. How do you sort of bridge that gap? Because you're trying to invest in the next generation of startups. Investors are expecting sort of a return. And how could the U.S. government potentially influence that as well?
Yeah, it's a great question. So again, going back to that framework, you need technology, capital, and policy to go together. I think where we're at is actually we're in a really good place in the U.S. in terms of we've got a lot of really great technological innovations that are just now coming to market. So at the Breakthrough Energy Ventures Fund, we've invested in about 100 companies. And of course, that's just one slice of the overall landscape. From a capital perspective, if you look at some of the information that's coming out of Bloomberg New Energy Finance, you saw a 20% jump in investment in the energy transition last year. And then in terms of policy, we've now seen in the span of a year two really significant bills, the largest investment in history in the U.S. pass. So we have the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act in the United States that will invest primarily in clean energy projects. So everything from advanced nuclear, long-duration energy storage, carbon capture, industrial decarbonization, and then you have the Inflation Reduction Act that has the largest package of tax credits for clean energy and climate technologies ever enacted. And I think what you see across those two bills, as well as the CHIPS and Science Act, which will invest mostly in sort of science and R&D, is we really have the beginnings of a true innovation and climate strategy coming together at the national level, where you've got policy ready to meet all this great innovation that's coming out of the market. In terms of that third leg of the stool, though, capital, I think that is where we really need to be attentive in the coming years, because you need to make sure, because the U.S. has primarily chosen an incentives-based policy, which we think is the most politically viable way forward. But nonetheless, because it is an incentives-based policy, the rate at which we'll be able to achieve the goals that we've set forth will depend on how fast industry, investors, venture capital, et cetera, are willing to go. And I think we're going to need to see a lot of creativity and ambition emerging in the next few years from folks on the capital side. So all of that to say, I think we're in a really good place, and we're very optimistic about what the future holds.
Well, obviously, it's been sort of a breakthrough year of sorts, if you will, small pun there, for the U.S. Huge piece of legislation, hundreds of billions of dollars devoted to this over the next decade. That's going to have transformational effects. I'm curious a little bit on the more global angle here, because obviously climate change is affecting everything from Australia to East Asia, Central Asia, over through Europe. And Sarah, you've both focused on the U.S., but also have this sort of comparative global perspective. How would you sort of may not rank, but how would you sort of compare how the U.S. has sort of approached around this inside of incentives-focused policy with this recent legislation from Congress with other initiatives you've seen from around the world?
Well, it's great that the US has done what it's done. About time, just saying. But of course, it's like a totally different country to everywhere else. Like, you have such an enormous industrial base in the US and a very tax incentives kind of model for industrial strategy. Other countries have done different things. And I think if you're a technologist trying to figure out where should you deploy, where should you base yourself, where should you build your first prototype, I do recommend a little bit of jurisdiction shopping and seeing which countries actually suit your approach best, because some country, Singapore is a great example. It's a very tech forward country. It's very fast moving. It's got Temasek, which is a great investor, and they've got very little, resources, as in land resources. So if you're building something that is about, really efficient growing of low carbon vegetables, Singapore might be a great place to base yourself. As I said, I think the US has done an amazing job, but I think where they are weaker than other countries, maybe on the regulatory speed side. Like, I think planning permission for getting things done, it's just going to be really hard. And other countries are much faster because they don't have the same governmental layers. So I think there's a little bit of opportunity now for other countries to say, okay, the US is really investing in those low carbon energy, building those sort of new energy sources. What can we do that is sort of going to make us a global exporter of the climate tech boom of the future?
Well, this reminds me of German policy in the 2000s and 2010s of adding wind energy. And we talked at the beginning of this panel about how there isn't a natural market for low emissions or zero emissions technologies, but the government can create those markets and actually be a buyer of first resort and be a really strong one. But that leads to a particularly focused question around energy. Obviously, governments in some cases are some of the largest users of energy. The Pentagon is the single largest buyer of fuel anywhere in the world. And I'm curious, Jesse, when you look at what's going on in the energy world today, 2022 has got to be probably the most fascinating year, I think, in your field for some time, whether it's the Russia's war on Ukraine, whether it's this risk of global recession. How in 2022 do you see the energy world today, and what should governments be doing to try to encourage moving towards a zero emissions future?
Yeah, so I mean, you hit on a key point, which is that there isn't really a key initial market for most of these technologies unless there's a government role to create a niche market. I mean, there are exceptions. You think about Tesla's strategy to bring the EV to market with a Roadster that was, high end and small bespoke production, and then they were able to leverage that into cheaper and cheaper vehicles. That works for consumer products in certain cases when you can kind of differentiate the features and kind of find it a niche early adopter. But the real big challenge about innovation in the energy space and across many of these climate solutions is that they're not pioneering a new terrain, right? It's not like information technology in the 1990s. These are technologies that are trying to take over incumbent industries that are well established, that have a century of scaling and infrastructure and learning by doing and cost declines. And so bridging that wall is very difficult to do. Even if there was a market for greener things, they'd just be more expensive at the beginning. And so there is, a big role to be played by, private sector actors that are willing to step up and pay that green premium at the beginning. The First Movers Coalition is a kind of global effort to pull those companies together together. Government procurement, historically has played a huge role in technological development, particularly in the defense space, with many, technologies that are now kind of general purpose technologies like semiconductors and laser and radar and all kinds of things, GPS, coming out of that space and kind of spilling over to enable other innovations. There's less budget outside of the Defense Department for that kind of thing, but the Inflation Reduction Act in the U.S. does include funding for the General Services Administration to procure green building materials for federal office buildings, to procure clean electricity for serving federal offices, to buy electric vehicles for fleets. So there is a direct role there. But the biggest one, and the one that the Inflation Reduction Act really embodies, is just the same as the German story. We're just going to create a market for these technologies and pay what it takes at the beginning when they're expensive, alternative energy technologies. And you look at solar, you look at wind, you look at lithium-ion batteries, LEDs, technologies that are just booming today are cheap, affordable, trillion-dollar markets. Those came directly from those early investments by governments to create the deployment and early market for those technologies. And so, when they were expensive, we paid the premium. When they are deployed at small scale, that's actually pretty affordable. So you can pay a lot, for each individual item when you're only buying a little bit. And we basically play the role that the early adopters would play in any kind of other market like smartphones or EVs, and then drive down those costs. And the costs have plummeted for technologies that have been supported in that way. Roughly 90% for solar and lithium-ion batteries, 95% for LEDs, and about 70% for onshore wind just over the last decade. And that kind of transformative change is what opens up all the political possibilities to drive more rapid decarbonization, and also for these technologies to spill over to the rest of the world that isn't willing to pay and can't pay that upfront premium. So if you think about like Germany or tiny Denmark, right, with spurring the initial market for wind and solar, their emissions themselves are not a big piece of the overall global puzzle. But by making solar and wind cheap and contributing to that along with a bunch of other countries, they probably had way more impact on the global emissions trajectory than, eliminating all of their domestic emissions. So I do think we have to remember the power of that spillover effect and the ability to drive down the cost of technologies. And governments are trying to unlock that now, both motivated by the climate urgency and then in Europe now and around the rest of the world, the changing geopolitical situation and the skyrocketing cost of fossil fuels in Europe. And so that has just added huge momentum in Europe to accelerate this transition as well. So I think with the U.S. and Europe both moving fast in this space, we've got a lot of excitement and a lot of opportunity ahead.
And that certainly pivots us a little bit into the regulatory space. I mean, you work in the energy field, a space that is extremely well regulated. Most energy companies work under a PUC, a Public Utility Commission, which sets rates, terms, infrastructure spend. And I remember talking to a couple of utility CEOs over the years, and one of the complaints they have is that they'd love to invest in smart grid technology, they'd love to invest in new power plants, but the challenge is that they're constrained by investors on Wall Street, they're constrained by the timings of a lot of these PUCs, as well as federal energy policy. I'm curious, when you're looking at these sort of first mover initiatives, as well as in industry dynamics, are you seeing a change in the regulatory field here to improve the focus on climate?
I don't see a lot of change on the regulatory side. I do see a change on the policy opportunity space. So you see, you do see some private sector actors like, Google and Microsoft, Stripe, others that are saying, look, I am explicitly willing to be the first mover here and to take some risk and to do that. Now, giant companies like that, they can do that. Not everybody can. Local utility commissions aren't going to generally let a, publicly regulated utility play that role. They'd all like to be the second or third mover, right? And so the opportunity there is in the things like the infrastructure law that is going to fund demonstration and kind of first N-of-a-kind projects across a variety of different spaces, whether that's clean hydrogen hubs and different ways to produce hydrogen, direct air capture, carbon capture, advanced nuclear, advanced geothermal. Like all of that is funded in the infrastructure law, and so those will be big, government cost share, basically saying I will de-risk that for the private, for the private sector, and that's a key role for government as well. So to get over that classic valley of death where you need a few $100 million or a couple $1 billion to build your first few projects. It's hard to raise that money from the private sector. It's hard to expect a regulated utility to do that. You're not going to get traditional project finance that's willing to take those risks. So the federal government and other governments around the world can take on that cost sharing role. And that's been transformative in the past. And I'm excited to see what happens over the next basically 5 years of funding under the infrastructure law. It's about $60 billion of total funding coming over the next 5-6 years for those kinds of projects.
Well, and it's a huge milestone. And Robin, you've been advocating in this industry for some time through Breakthrough Energies and elsewhere. And I'm curious, now that you've had several landmark pieces of legislation, tens of billions of dollars put on the table, so to speak, for incentives and purchasing, I'm curious what's sort of the plan going forward. How do you keep people engaged both on the advocacy side and the policy side for the next steps ahead?
Well, I don't think engagement will be a problem because I have to say everyone is both incredibly excited in the advocacy and philanthropic community about where we're at, and also very aware of the fact that in a lot of ways we now have to land the plane that we launched. So I think there's a lot of conversation happening right now about what comes next as far as implementation, right? We need to make sure that at the early stages, for example, with tax credits, we don't have the situation that we had with 45Q where it took over 2 years to get final guidance for the tax credit. That was valuable time lost. You saw basically no industry activity in that period of time. Now that we have all these new tax credits that have to basically start from scratch, and of course that have new aspects to them, like we have, in some cases, bonuses for prevailing wage, companies that meet prevailing wage or are able to use domestic content. In some cases, we tie the tax credit value to things like carbon intensity across the life cycle of hydrogen production or greenhouse gas intensity in that case. So there's going to be a lot of need to focus on helping agencies get it right. So that's kind of step one. Step two is making sure that those projects land in places that aren't just the places that are really good at knowing how to access federal funding. We need to make sure that this is a sort of, from a political economy standpoint, a broadly shared experience, that we make sure that places like Houston, Texas, I'm biased, I'm from there, but they have a ton of existing infrastructure, know-how, jobs that can be put to use, that they're ready to step up and access funding. So there's going to be a need. Maybe Houston doesn't need it, but South Bend, Indiana might. There's going to be a need for technical assistance, helping applicants access funding. And then the third step is really making sure that people understand the huge benefits that will be realized through this investment. So, we think of this as kind of winning the win, because we unfortunately don't have the benefit of having things that are super salient and tangible and visible to people, or at least if you're not working at a facility, and directly employed at a project, it's a little harder for you to understand that when you flip the lights on, now you get those electrons from a clean place instead of from a coal facility, that people understand the benefits that are accruing through this investment. So I think that is going to be really key from an advocacy perspective. And then I also think there are a few other things we need to be really attentive to. We already talked about sort of the voluntary adoption aspect of an incentives-based approach. I think we're going to need to do a lot of engagement with investors to get them comfortable with moving quickly. As Jesse pointed out, there will be some risk aversion at the beginning that we need to overcome with some of these new technologies. And then lastly, I think we really need to think about things like regulation permitting, because it is a fundamental issue that you can build natural gas pipelines very easily, and you can't build a transmission project that crosses state lines in less than 10 years. We need to be able to, at all levels, at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level, make sure that we're able to build things.
Yeah, if I could just jump in on that. I think there's sort of a lack of appreciation of the inflection point that we're at now, where that we've been modeling the impacts of the federal bills as they've kind of come about as part of the repeat project. And what we see is that throughout U.S. history, we've basically, outside of recessions, consumed more oil and gas every year for history, throughout history, since we discovered oil and gas, right? You keep using more and more. And since about 2005, electricity demand has been flat. So people who kind of entered into this world since then, are thinking about business opportunities, thinking about business strategy at a Fortune 500 company, whatever. Like those are just sort of like facts in the background, right? Oil and gas demand goes up, electricity demand relatively flat. Both of those trends are going to reverse under after the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, if we do this right, at least. If we can get the build out at scale, we are going to see sustained demand growth for electricity resume again for the first time since the 1990s. Demand could grow by more than 20% over the next decade alone due to electrification of vehicles and heat pumps and electrolysis and all those kinds of new electricity demands. And at the same time, we're likely to see the first sustained decline in oil and natural gas demand in U.S. history. That's on top of what Europe's doing, right, to transition rapidly away from those fuels. And I do think that is just going to fundamentally transform the kind of backdrop for so many of these conversations. And what it means is that there's a huge need for new investment in infrastructure in the electricity space that I don't think people have really kind of got their heads around. We have to go so much faster than we have in the past because we not only need to drive down our use of natural gas and coal for power generation, we also now have to keep up with that growing demand for clean electricity from EVs and heat pumps and electrolyzers and everything else. So building stuff is a huge challenge. It's going to be the kind of central battleground in many ways for the next 10 years. But I do think that the shifting sense of the business opportunity here and investment opportunity is just starting to trickle into private equity and growth capital investors and and others in this space. And it's really a transformative shift in our energy sectors.
Well, and we've obviously talked about the United States a lot. I also want to get a global sense because obviously this legislation doesn't just apply to the U.S. It also has knock-on effects all across the world. I'm most familiar with the CHIPS and Science Act, which has had repercussions in countries like South Korea, Japan, along with Taiwan, where there are concerns that we're trying to domesticate industries that those countries are leading in. And Sarah, given your sort of global perspective, I'm curious your post-take on the IRA, the CHIPS and Science Act, all these new bills. Is it pushing other countries in new policy directions? Does it change the dynamics for how these countries are approaching funding of startups and encouraging them? What happens globally given this new legislation?
To be honest, I don't think governments really think like that. They are far too concerned with their own domestic concerns. And even though Americans always think everyone's looking at America, sure, we're curious, but I don't think it's really determining very much. I think the more interesting question is, from my perspective, is how is the politics changing? The regulation and the funding, the IRA and the infrastructure and the CHIPS Act, frankly, have done an amazing job of creating this foundational, as Jesse said, sort of restructuring of the US energy sector. But actually, the politics of climate are now getting really complicated. And I think, certainly here in Europe, as we mentioned with the war in Ukraine, the cost of being dependent on fossil fuels is really high. But the actual cash going out is going to subsidizing that use of fossil fuel. And actually, the populist parties are frankly starting to question the sensibleness of net zero. And I think finding opportunities to campaign around dropping some of the rapid net zero changes, because as Jesse said, our emissions are not as high, frankly, as other countries, and yet the costs are claimed to be enormous. I would challenge that, but that's what they claim. So I do think the politics of climate are going to get a lot more complicated globally, and I think actually it's really important for the green movement to not be its echo chamber and actually to be much more of a broader church and really focus on the growth and the jobs opportunities. That's what I think the Inflation Reduction Act has done so well, is say that this is actually a growth and jobs act. It's not a green act. And that is where I think we're going to be able to build these sort of broader coalitions to keep the momentum going when other international events make the case for investing in long-term, potentially quite, long to return financially as well as practically. Technologies that some people find they can't afford right now.
If I could jump in there. Oh, sorry, Jesse, just quickly. I wanted to say, on this topic about sort of how the U.S. strategy is shifting much more toward a focus on bringing things back home. Climate is a global problem, and it is inherently, therefore, a cooperative need. And I think it would be unhelpful if the message that countries that we've traditionally had close allied relationships with receive is that we're now shutting them out of our markets. And I also don't think it would be realistic to assume that we're going to be able to bring every single component in the supply chain back home. I do think that what we'll see, though, is that we'll need to be looking across the value chain for things that we know are strategically important to us, either for national security or climate reasons or both, and assessing where we can do that, reshore things, and where we might need to do more of a friend shoring approach where we work cooperatively with allies to make sure that everyone is sort of able to perform the roles that they're best equipped to do, and that we don't undermine the cooperation that is so critical and central to climate.
Jesse, you had something.
Yeah, I just wanted to stress how intersectional the politics have become on this, because you could say the Inflation Reduction Act is a climate bill, but it's important to note it is the Inflation Reduction Act, right? It's not the Green Energy for All Act or something like that, right? And so it works in so many different contexts. It is about making clean energy cheap, but it's also just about making energy cheap, right? It's about making energy more accessible for all. It's about lowering energy costs. It's about making our economy more secure to the global price volatility in the oil and gas markets. I mean, the fact that the United States is now a net exporter of oil and gas, and yet when Vladimir Putin starts a war on the other side of the world, immediately prices at the pump here double, right, or triple, that we are not secure to that kind of economic volatility. And transitioning to cleaner energy sources makes that makes us much more insulated from that in the future. It's the same in Europe, right? Europe was already underway in a clean energy transition because of climate, goals, but now is going to accelerate all of that because of national security and energy security, prerogatives. And it's worth going all the way back to the beginning of, the growth, the emergence of nuclear power, of wind, of solar, even of unconventional natural gas, like hydraulic fracturing, all came out of energy security motivations, right, in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, not climate change. And so, we're tackling more than one thing at once, and we need to make sure that we're communicating that. I think companies need to be clear when they're making their value proposition and their pitch, how they intersect with those different public priorities. Because again, this is a public-private objective. And so you can intersect with and sell the public narrative and story about how you're solving key societal challenges, and you're going to make a bunch of money while you do it. That's the most compelling investment pitch too.
Well, if I had to summarize, I love Robin's comment of friend shoring, Jesse with a focus on resilience and solving some of the most tough societal challenges, and Sarah, your focus as well of doubling down and saying that these are opportunities to connect the globe together, to work with our friends and allies along this. About 2 weeks after this conference is going to be COP27, a major international climate confab, and so when it comes to the right role for the Uncle Sam in the climate world, I think we're going to find out very shortly after this, exactly what role it's going to take. But Sarah, Jesse, and Robin, thank you so much for joining us on this panel today. Glad you were here.